Hi, I'm Edwin Rutsch, and this is Dialogues on How to Build a Culture of Empathy. And today I'm very pleased to be here with Heidi Maibom. Hi, Heidi.
Hi,
Yeah,
pleased to
thank
be
you.
here.
Yeah, thanks for joining me for this dialogue. Really looking forward to it. To begin with, I just wanted to introduce you. You're a professor of philosophy at the University of Cincinnati, and from your bio, I saw you work on folk psychology, empathy, responsibility, and psychopathy. Is that right? Maybe you want to expand on
Yeah,
that.
that's a good overview.
And the reason I kind of got in contact with you is you're editor of a book that's just come out called Empathy and Morality, and we wanted to talk about that. And in this discussion, we wanted to go over your chapter. You wrote the first chapter, which is called Everything You Wanted to Know About Empathy. So I'm really excited about that topic. Can you tell me a little bit like how your book came about and kind of what inspired you to write and edit this book?
Yeah, so I was at a panel on empathy at the American Philosophical Association, organized by Amy Copeland and an editor from Oxford University Press. Peter Olin was there, and he subsequently emailed me and asked me about whether it would be a good idea to have an edited volume on this topic, and I volunteered to get one together.
Hmm.
So,
And empathy's been a subject you've been interested in for a while, or?
yeah, I think I've worked on empathy for, um, God, I'm getting old. I guess the last 8, 9 years.
Oh, wow.
Not exclusively, but on and off together with other topics like responsibility and psychopathology and so on. But
You say folk psychology. What does that mean? Just curious.
folk psychology is also known sometimes as common sense psychology or theory of mind,
Mm,
as psychologists call it. So it's the ability to think of others in terms of psychological properties. So in terms of what they believe, what they want, what they feel, what they intend to do.
hmm And what got you interested in the subject of empathy to begin with? Was there any sort of a precipitating aha moment, or what was it that got you interested in this topic?
It was because I was working on the question about psychopaths and morality. So people have been very interested in psychopathy over the last, I think, 10, 15 years. And a very common way to think about psychopaths is that they lack morality in some interesting sense. They're amoral or immoral, depending on your view. And so the interesting question is, well, what is it about psychopaths that make them immoral in this way? And a very common way to think about it is, well, they lack empathy. Um, and I worked, I argued against the idea that the only deficit that they have is a lack of empathy. Rather, I argued that they also have deficient capacity to make good decisions. So when people think about the sort of psychological underpinnings of morality, so what kind of psychological features that make us moral in a certain sense, there is sort of a tendency to think of it in terms of a dichotomy between like either it's emotions or it's reason that run the system, as it were, right? And a lot of people think of it as sort of a stylized approach from Kant being it's about reason, and in terms of sort of Hume and Adam Smith, it's about emotions, particularly empathy. And what I did was that I just looked at on a lot of the literature of psychopaths, and that suggests that they're actually bad at what philosophers would call practical reason, but that is to make good decisions. So they're actually, they make terrible decisions for themselves too. They're not good at long-term planning and so forth and so on. So even though I don't think that there's any doubt that they have empathy deficits, they also have some kind of practical reasoning deficits. So at that point, I think it's kind of, you can give support to either the sort of emotion or reason account, if you like. I tend to think that the problem is that the traditional way of thinking about emotions and reason are just outdated. I think we know more about how decision-making works and how it involves some traditionally regarded affective features, and how some kind of affect is much more infused with, let's call it reasoning structures, if you like. So that was kind of, I think that was the beginning of me getting more interested in empathy, thinking about what is the role of empathy in moral reasoning, moral capacities, and so on.
Well, we could step back even farther. So it sounds like you're interested in psychopathy, and then that kind of led you into empathy. What got you interested in psychopath?
Oh, it's just
psychopathy, or however, yeah.
I guess in a certain sense it was, I was teaching a course at Washington University in St. Louis where I was a postdoc on moral psychology, and I was teaching a really interesting paper by Sean Nichols where he argues that psychopaths are, their immorality, as it were, or their incapacity to make true moral judgment is based in their lacking empathy. I mean, he calls it a different name, and he has some interesting distinctions that I guess we don't need to go into here, but that was the basic idea. And I was also reading a paper with the students by a person working on Kant who just gave a more, how can I put it, down-to-earth, practical decision-making interpretation of what Kant was about. And putting the two together, it seemed as if the thinking of psychopathy purely in terms of deficient empathy is just not right. It leaves something, I think, possibly quite important out.
Mm-hmm. So I'm not still not. You're saying that you came to empathy from psychopathy, like studying psychopathy, and I guess I'm kind of looking at like what was the motivation to study that? It's kind of like, is it there was something? Is it more like just an intellectual exploration that happened? Like, oh, this is pretty interesting. And you got deeper and deeper into it, or you know, is it like, oh, the world? It seems to be kind of. It seems to be a lot of psychopaths in the world, and it's causing a lot of destruction. I guess I'm kind of wondering what the underlying, you know, what was the inspiration? Was it like an old boyfriend who, you know, was like a psychopath or something? You know what I mean? It's like, what was the kind of the motivating kind of inspiration for that?
Well, I mean, I've been interested in more what philosophers call moral psychology. So the question of what kind of psychological features underlie our ability to make moral judgments, to be morally motivated, to act morally. When you think about that topic, people are, of course, interested in the question, can we understand morality and what makes us moral by looking at people who are not moral and then see what they're lacking, right? And I think there a lot of people think that the psychopath is like the perfect example of the amoral or immoral individual, and you simply don't find, I mean, if you look at other mental disorders, you know, narcissists obviously aren't particularly nice people and so forth and so on, but they don't seem to have the sort of pervasive amoral profile that the psychopath does, and so therefore I think psychopathy has really caught the attention of a lot of people who are thinking about, you know, being able to make judgments of right and wrong, whether or not people are morally or legally responsible for their actions, and if you're, you know, suffer from psychopathy, are you responsible for your actions and so forth and so on, right? So I think that it's really the idea that in some way or other the psychopath sort of incorporates the amoral individual. And so it's almost like, you know, a lot of people do studies on patients with brain damage, right? And then they say, oh, well, you know, people who have damage to this area of the brain can't do these things, and so maybe we can understand better what's involved in these types of activities.
Okay, so it's really about you were interested in morality, and then it's like, well, if I want to study morality, I should look at the extreme cases of the lack of morality, and then you're going into exploring that, and then that leads to empathy. Then, sort of, that's kind of like the track I'm hearing.
Yeah.
Okay, and then I guess the question is what was the interest in morality, and what are you meaning by morality?
Oh, you know, it's a really good question, but I can't remember. I wish I had a really great answer. It just happened gradually, and then I got more and more interested, I suppose.
It's kind of like morality is how you act in a positive way towards other people, or in a caring way, or, you know, what are you kind of meaning by morality?
Well, yeah, I guess that to think of, I mean, if you think about thinking morally, right? When you judge that something is right or wrong or good or bad, right? So, you know, you think, well, you know, it's wrong to set the cat on fire just to have fun, you know. It's a classical example from another philosopher. Or, you know, it's wrong to cheat on your taxes or something like that, right? So you might think of morality in if you think of it in terms of your thinking or your, you know, verbal statements, you know, then you can think of morality as the sort of class of judgments about what is right or wrong or good and bad.
Okay, so it's a little bit like how do you navigate yourself through the world? Like, what are the actions you take? What are like good actions and negative actions, maybe?
Yeah. So a lot of people are, you know, if you were Kant, you thought of morality as being completely authoritative over your actions, right? So if you judge something is wrong, you're thereby motivated not to do it, right? And the idea, it's got to be something like, if something is morally wrong, then that is just something, you're not going to act against it, right? So it restricts your behavioral, what you're going to do.
So the morality puts kind of like restrictions on your actions, then.
Yeah, so you can think of morality as like a veto. Or, so, you know, there might be a veto, right? So you think, well, you know, should I set the neighbor's car on fire because she annoyed me? Hopefully, your moral sense or whatever is going to step in and say, no, that's not okay, right? That would be wrong. And then you can think of, depending a little bit on whether you want to think about morality negatively or positively, right? I think that there's a tendency to think of morality negatively in the following sense, that it's what restricts your actions, right? So you're not supposed to lie or steal or harm others and so forth, right? That's the do not part of morality, right? But of course, there's also this other part of morality, which is, you know, helping others, doing kind things for others, and so forth and so on, which you might think of the more positive side of morality. So instead of simply vetoing actions, you might think it's something that propels you to do sort of more positive things.
Okay, so there's the morality in the sense of a set of rules that inhibit your actions, and then morality in terms of what it is that you do, and in terms of the actions that you actually do. And looking at that, those I don't know if they're judgments or those possibilities of action, then.
Yeah, I mean, I think philosophers tend to use the term moral judgment, by which they might mean a whole lot of things. I mean, you could think of it just as, you know, affirming a thought, thinking affirmatively, this is right or this is wrong or something like that. That I think that would be a simpler way of talking about moral judgment.
Okay, well, so that's what your book is. Let me put up on the screen here again. So, empathy and morality, and you've got this. I don't know what the figure is. It looks like a Hindu god, multi-armed.
It's Guan Yin. So Guan Yin is the Chinese name for the Buddha of compassion.
Oh, okay.
Which is classically portrayed as a female Buddha.
And what's this?
Avatokti Tashvara or something like that in Indian, in Hindu. Sorry, that would be Sanskrit. But yeah, so it's you can think of it as the Buddha of compassion.
Okay,
so
that's the Buddha of compassion.
All the arms. I think there are supposed to be eyes somewhere, although I don't see it on the image. Right. So the idea is that the Buddha of compassion has a 1,000 eyes and to see the suffering and 1,000 hands to alleviate the suffering.
Oh, okay. Well, that was a little bit, my interpretation is as we get into your chapter, which is everything you want to know about empathy. I kind of was, and you kind of get it, you start off with kind of looking at the definitions, and I thought all those arms might be all the definitions of empathy. There seems to be so many definitions, you kind of start going into it with your chapter and in terms of starting to lay out some of those definitions.
Yeah. Yeah. So the term empathy is, I think, used in, I think, probably 3 main different ways. So one way is to just think about cognitive empathy or perspective taking, so taking somebody else's perspective, thinking about how they feel, what they think, whatever, in their situation that they're in. So that most people think is more or less a purely cognitive enterprise, so it's about the way that you think about the other. The kind of empathy that people tend to be more interested in when they're dealing with the question of moral judgment and psychopathy and so forth and so on is affective empathy, by which people tend to mean either what we might call sympathy, so feeling warm, compassionate, tender feelings towards somebody else. And it seems as if something like, I'm going to call it sympathy, and I think I use the term sympathy in the book too, primarily because that's a term philosophers use. Somebody like Dan Batson, who has done marvelous work in psychology, uses empathic concern for the same concept. But sympathy or empathic concern would be what you might think of an emotion in its own right, more or less, right? So you might think maybe there are 2 variations, like you could feel, if you feel sympathy for somebody and they're in a good situation, there's going to be something positive or up about that sympathy, right? But if they're in a bad situation, then there's going to be more of a down feeling to it or whatever. But the idea is, I think, that sympathy is directed at how the other person is doing, their welfare. And that emotion isn't necessarily going to correspond to what the person is feeling in their situation. By contrast, when people tend to talk about empathy, what they mean is experiencing an emotion that is very much like the emotion that the person is feeling in the situation. So, for instance, if you're afraid, I could be afraid for you, for instance, right? Or you're sad, and I feel sad too, right? And so that's where another distinction is often made between emotional contagion and empathy. So there's, I think, really good evidence that we're very sensitive to emotions that other people experience, particularly if they display them in some way or another, right? So if somebody's really sad, we often get to feel sad and so forth and so on, right? But sometimes those effects can occur without us being aware that it's caused by the other person, and without, therefore, the emotion being properly empathetic. So you might think of, for instance, you walk into a room and everybody's laughing and everybody's happy. Often you will come to feel happy too, but it's not. It doesn't seem quite right to say that it's because you're empathizing with the others, right? It's just that the happiness is kind of contagious in a certain sense, right? And so when you're empathizing, there's this interesting question, what exactly the distinction is between that and the contagion, but at least what must be involved, it seems to be, is that you are aware that you're experiencing the emotion because the other person is experiencing it, and in some interesting sense, you're experiencing it for the other.
Yeah, it's with empathy. I've talked with a lot of people like Dan Batson as well, about his definitions of empathy, and he says there's so many different. He's laid out like a lot of different ways. He has one book or chapter where he kind of laid out like 8 different ways. And he writes the second chapter in your book as well. I see, and so it's well, for me it's like there's the word empathy is just a symbol. I mean, it's kind of like doesn't mean anything. You can have any symbol, and it seems to be all these different experiences get attached to that. And it seems that all these different fields have different definitions, or they're looking at the word from different sides, and they're kind of stretching and pulling the definition in a lot of different directions. Do you think that's kind of like a fair?
Well, I'd like not to exaggerate the degree to which people disagree. I mean, I think that there is. I mean, I think when you read through the literature, there are definitely points when it's confusing, right? Because some people will use the term sympathy, and somebody like Batson, for instance, will use empathetic concern. Or if you look at some of the psychological measurements of empathy, like the interpersonal reactivity index, right? Then one of the subscales is empathic concern, too, which seems to be more like sympathy than empathy as I have described it. But having said that, I think that there's my sense is that there is more agreement, certainly about what the concepts are. There's a lot of agreement of using term empathy versus sympathy, certainly in the philosophical literature. And so I don't think it's quite as hard to navigate as some people make out.
Okay.
So I agree with you, there are differences, but I don't think it's...
it's not so broad. It's not so wide of a difference.
I think you can still navigate, but you need to pay attention. So you can't just pick the term and then be sure that that term means the same as it does in other literatures. But typically, it's really, empathetic concern versus sympathy, for instance, is perhaps the biggest one.
Well, when I interviewed Dan, he was Dan Batson. He said, it's important to just define your terms to begin with, like how you're using it, and then kind of stick with that. So maybe I could just go through how I've been using the term empathy. So for me, I call it the wheel of empathy. So it starts with actually self-empathy, which is sensory awareness of what's going on inside of ourselves, in the sense that without a self, we're not going to be able to empathize with others, so it's part of the overall process. And that's the sensory awareness of what our own feelings and visceral experiences are. Then there's the what I would call mirrored empathy, or would be called affective or the emotional empathy, which is that when we see an action or do the action, that the same neurons fire, supposedly through mirror neurons. So it's what you're talking about with the affective empathy, where if I'm moving my hands, you would be feeling the sensation of me moving my hands like this, or you hear in terms of that your neurons are firing to simulate that. And so that would be kind of like the affective or mirrored empathy. Then what you're calling the emotion, cognitive empathy or perspective taking, I like the term imaginative empathy, in that I can imagine myself in someone else's role and then feel myself into that role and take the perspective from what it feels like to be that other person. And that would be the imaginative empathy. And then what comes out of that is when we have this sense of connection with others, there's a quality of creativity that can happen in terms of contributing to the well-being of others. And that would be like an empathic creativity or action that might, and so that's kind of like the general kind of framework that I've been using. So I'm just kind of wondering how that fits with what you,
well, I mean, I guess it would, I mean, first of all, I'm not sure that we have selves at all. I think that's a really hard question. So I think the first thing I would prefer to call something like perceptual awareness or something like that. Perhaps of your body.
Mm-hmm.
Presumably of your body.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that with the mirror neurons, it's complicated. So the fact that I mean, first of all, most of the neuroneuron research is on macaques, right, who've had their skull sawed off and have electrodes directly implanted into the brain, and there's very little actual evidence with humans, right? So it's all based on inference from the homology between human brains and monkey brains. But you know, it seems plausible that we have mirror neurons, but there are different kinds of mirror neurons, and the fact that the same neuron might fire when you perform an action, when somebody else performs an action, I think that that could simply just be understood that there is a joint representation, and that doesn't, I think, imply that either we're simulating others or that we're feeling the same as other people are feeling or whatever. It just means that the same neurons are dedicated to decoding actions. And yeah.
So you're not so sure that mirror neurons are really doing the mirroring, that that they're not mirroring others' actions, that they're doing something else?
Well, I mean, it depends on. I think the crucial question is how you understand mirroring, right? So a lot of people, at a point at least, got very excited about the mirror neurons, right? And that it showed that there was some kind of basic empathy going on. I'm not sure it shows that at all.
Uh-huh.
All it shows is that certain types of action sequences are represented by the firing, or rather their representation is embodied or embrained by the firing of the same neuron, right? But a lot of it lies in how you interpret the fact that one neuron fires when you're reaching out for a glass and when somebody else is reaching out for a glass, right? And I think that there are very thick interpretations that you can give. And I think that the thicker the interpretation is, the less it's supported by the evidence. I think that you can have a relatively thin interpretation of what mirror neurons do that aren't, that just simply doesn't involve this more pregnant notion of empathy or feeling with the other as they're acting the way that they're acting.
Okay, then let's see. In terms of the chapters, so what else is there more around? Maybe we could just go through the different sections. You've got 9 sections in your first chapter. Maybe we could just get kind of like an overview of what you cover in the different chapters. I mean, different sub-chapters.
Yeah. Roots to empathy.
Yeah, the first one is you're kind of talking about effective empathy, sympathy, emotional contagion, and personal distress.
Oh yeah, so we haven't talked about personal distress yet.
Mm-hmm.
So personal distress is a really interesting category. It's one that you find mainly in the psychology literature. Philosophers tend not to talk so much about it, but if you think about what personal distress is, it looks like personal distress has a lot in common with empathy as I have defined it, right? So you're seeing somebody else or imagining somebody else in a very distressing situation, and then you get to feel distressed. So you have the sort of what appears to be almost the homology of an emotional reaction, right? And as far as I can tell, the evidence suggests that when you feel distress in response to somebody else being distressed, there are two aspects to it. You feel distress partly for yourself and partly for the other. And so then when you were talking before about imagining being in somebody else's position, that part of empathy for you, it does make a difference whether you're imagining that you're in the other person's situation or you're just imagining how the other person feels in that situation. I'm sure you talked to Dan about that too, right? That's one of the things that he's been very influential in promoting the idea that there's this really solid distinction. But personal distress for Batson, I mean, in his literature, because he's interested in altruism, personal distress is, in a certain sense, the bad emotion because it's the egoistic emotion or the self-directed emotion, if you like, right? And the sympathy or empathic concern is good. I'm not saying that Batson says this himself. He's very careful about how he phrases things, but I think this is the message that a lot of people take out of it. Sympathy is good because it leads to altruistic motivation, so motivation of the other for their sake. But personal distress may be one of those emotions that is the frontline response to distress in others. And it may be connected with, I think, more morally interesting features than people have often thought. So, for instance, a lot of the fMRI data suggests that when you present people with pictures of others in distress, they do have a stress reaction, right, which looks much more like personal distress, which activates areas of the brain that are associated with fear and defensive action. So one way to look at it is perhaps what is called personal distress is a reaction to pain in others as a threat to yourself, almost as you would react to pain in yourself. Right? So that's a really interesting. I think from a certain perspective, it's a socially really interesting emotion, right? Because it's almost like we're seeing others as an extension of ourselves, if you like. But it may very well be because it activates those fear-related and defensive areas of the brain, or rather the areas of the brain that are associated with defensive action, that it typically leads to retreating from the situation if it's possible, right? So that will fit with Batson's data. But that might be, in certain cases, useful. For instance, if you're the cause of the distress, so if you're the aggressor, if you're beating somebody else and you have that reaction, you can leave the situation, right? So, I mean, I think that there are a lot of, and that's associated with this idea of empathy and aggression and so forth and so on. So I think that personal distress is a really interesting category that has been underexplored. And I've just sort of come up with sort of various hypotheses about the role that it might play that might make it more palatable, because even if it might not lead to altruistic motivation, it might lead to, let's say, morally useful motivation under certain circumstances, at least.
Well, I have an actual story about that. Maybe I can just share it and we can see how this maps onto that, my personal experience. So this was a Christmas a year ago. We had a family get together, and a conflict or a fight started between my mother and my sister-in-law. So they were, it was like ratcheting up. They were getting angrier and angrier. It was pointing, "Don't talk to me this way." And I mean, the energy was just really ratcheting up. Yeah. And I thought, okay, what do I do about this situation? And I thought, well, I'll step into it. But I could really feel in myself like that. I mean, talking about personal distress, it was like icicles of fear through myself, through the core of my being. It was like if I felt into my bones, it felt like the fear was like icicles within the core of my bones. And it was like, how do I step into this in an empathic way, And what I started doing is I said to my sister-in-law, she was, had her point of view that she was saying, and they weren't listening to each other. And I started going into doing empathic listening, which is kind of reflective, empathic reflective listening, which is very, if you're familiar with, Carl Rogers and how he worked with empathy in his therapeutic settings. Is I just started reflecting back what my sister-in-law was saying. I said, "Oh, you're really upset about this. Am I hearing you correctly?" And I just started reflecting back what she was saying until she felt heard enough. She said, "Yeah, you're hearing what I'm saying." Then I went over and I started empathizing, reflecting what my mother was saying, and then I kept going back and forth between the two of them. And it was like really scary to step into that space and maintain an open, connecting, reflective relationship with both of them. And then as I started empathizing with each of them, they started feeling heard and feeling seen and understood. And their energy level, their anger, started going down to the point where I said, would you now be willing to reflect back what you're hearing the other person say until they feel heard? Then it will be your turn to speak, and they will reflect back what they're hearing you say. So they started doing that, and they were struggling with it. One person would say something, and the other one would want to respond right away, fight back. And I say, no, just let that person know what it is that you heard them say. You'll have your chance. And, and I had to kind of keep them on track. And then it turned into a whole family empathy circle where the whole family kind of gathered around. And it turned into this kind of me holding this empathic listening within the whole family. And then what kind of arose was my sister-in-law was saying, well, she didn't feel accepted in the family. So this was like the underlying, part of the underlying conflict. And then my father, he got up and said, I really care about you, and this is, you're an important part of the family, and they got up and hugged. And then, it took another half an hour, we kept doing that empathic listening, and then there was a connection happened between my mother and sister-in-law, and it ended with just this sense of connection between everybody, and at the end, my sister-in-law and mother were sitting on the sofa, kind of snuggled up, holding hands, and having come to this sense of connection. But the first part was that personal distress. The stepping into this raw, battle emotion was really scary to me. I mean, it was like affecting me at my core. And I think it was only that I do a lot of empathic listening and a lot of these empathy circles and a lot of practice that I had kind of like a resilience for being able to step into that space and translate or transfer that fear and anxiety into connection between and so forth. So I'm just wondering how that kind of sounds and how that kind of fits in terms of the different aspects of empathy.
Well, I think that one of the things that you point to there, which is often not considered a lot, but people are considering it more now. So Nancy Eisenberg talks a lot about it, and that is emotional regulation. I guess it's sort of catch-all term that psychology uses. And what exactly does it mean? Well, as I understand it, it means that you have an ability to downregulate very strong emotional responses to others. And to be sensitive, not to be overwhelmed by your, as it were, your emotionality. And I think that what it sounds like what you were doing a lot was that you were sort of almost acting like the emotional regulator between the two. So by you listening to them and being sensitive to them, their extreme affect was reduced with the subsequent capacity to, as it were, take other things in as well. And so I think that the example that you use is interesting, because I think that there is a confluence of what people talk of as perspective taking. I don't know whether it was really like you were imagining being in their situation, or you were just really thinking about how they were feeling and thinking.
I was just reflecting. I was not doing like role taking. All I was doing, I didn't even add anything from myself. All I did was maintain a reflective stance, and then I was holding the intention is I want the reflective empathic space that I'm wanting to create a sense of connection between all people in the environment. And that I am doing that through this mirroring of letting everyone know that they're seen and heard and basically understood, and that I'm encouraging them to do the same for each other. So, but I did not take their perspective. I did not say, oh, I know how you feel, or in your situation, how would I feel? I didn't step into that. For that, I would say I was kind of in the mirrored or affective or emotional empathy state primarily. So let me just ask you, so I mean, you were talking to them, and when you were talking to them, you were presumably thinking about how they were feeling and talking to them about how they were feeling, no? I didn't know. I said, let me just reflect what I'm hearing you say. And they would say, I'm so angry, this is just not right. And I say, I'm hearing that you're not angry and you're not feeling this right. Am I hearing you correctly? They said, that's right. I always come here and I always get pushed around or bossed around, and I just don't like it. So I say, I'm hearing that you don't, when you come here, you feel that you're just pushed around and you're bossed around, you don't like it. Am I hearing you correctly? And they said, yeah, that's right. And so this just kind of continued until there came a point where, just through that reflection, at some point the person had said whatever it is that they wanted to say, and they felt heard about it, and then I would shift to the other party and do the same thing. So they were hearing each other, and they were hearing themselves reflected, and then to the point that actually you're talking about the down regulation, that it brought the fight down lower, to the point where they were able to start doing that reflective, with me kind of helping to hold the space to do the reflection of each other. And it's as they started to understand each other and hear each other's position, it's like the conflict and the understanding, I mean, the conflict seemed to go down, and they started to understand where the other person was coming from, what was underneath. To the point where a real resonance kind of happened between each other and actually in the whole family.
Yes, I mean, it sounds like, I mean, part of what was going on initially was almost like a cathartic element, right? They are allowed to express themselves, angry, but without retaliation from the other, because you're just reflecting back, you're just saying, this is what you're saying, so forth and so on. And then they get to get it all out in a certain sense. And so it seems as if there was almost sort of a, relief at having been allowed to be angry without getting retaliated against, and being able to say what you want to say, and then calming down, and so thereby being at a level of affectivity that is more amenable to listening to
the other person.
To the other person.
Yeah. Well, there's in a situation like this, there's you hear of fight, flight, or freeze, right? So in that situation, something had happened that had set them off. They were in a fight mode, and then here I am in that environment, and I'm saying, well, I can start fighting. I could take one side or the other and say, no, you're wrong. And then engage in the battle and in the fight. I could freeze, which is with the fear and anxiety. I kind of felt like freezing. It's like I don't want to do anything. It's just it's because it's so painful and so scary to step into this. Or I could withdraw, the flee, and just leave the situation, let them deal with it. And so actually it seems to me that empathy is almost like a fourth mode. There's fight, flight, freeze, or empathy. And that this doesn't really get addressed in this. It doesn't get talked about. In that I said, no, I want to hold an empathic space, which is I will offer myself as a mirror, as a reflection of where you are, and actually hear where you are. And it seems that being seen like that actually transforms the conflict from disconnection into moving towards deeper connection, and that's how it actually ended. Was just kind of a really wonderful connection between everyone there.
Yeah. So I mean I think that there is a way of thinking about emotions, which I think is partly right. So you think, well, what is an emotion of sort of fear? Well, it is a reaction to what is regarded as an outside threat. It involves certain kind of physiological reactions, and it has certain motivational aspects to it, namely, as you pointed out, freeze, flight, or fight. It's a little more complicated than that, but it's that's sort of a fair description. But I mean, the fact is that we, and I think a lot of other non-human animals we're not just automata, right? So we experience an emotion, but you also have a lot of other emotions, and you have a lot of knowledge, and you have a lot of ability. And from hearing you have a lot of ability to modulate your emotions too, through long practice as well. And so I think that you have what you might call an empathic, a sympathetic, or a compassionate response, because you have all these other feelings because of the particular situation that you're in. It's your family members. You can't really, you could escape it, but how far can you go? And then you have all these other things that you would like to achieve, right? So I think that the sort of distressed response that we might have to others and their conflicts might lead to an initial response of fear, and then a lot depends on what the rest of our psychology looks like and what our other thoughts are. So somebody like Disati has done more work on how our empathic responses are often quite sensitive to features of the situation that aren't completely obvious in the sort of, you can see it, if you like, right? So somebody's undergoing a painful treatment, but is the treatment going to be successful or not? And it turns out that if people are told that the treatment is not successful, then they get more distressed when they watch the other undergoing this treatment. Or even young children don't seem to feel a lot of sympathy for somebody who pretends to be in pain when practically, when there doesn't seem to be, the situation doesn't seem to um, what do you call it? When it doesn't seem like a reasonable reaction, right? So, for instance, if you know, somebody poked me very lightly on the shoulder and I started, you know, breaking into tears, children tend not to be very sensitive to that compared to if somebody punches me on the shoulder. And so there seems to be, I mean, our reactions are really very sophisticated, and I think that in emotion research, we're just sort of beginning to look into the more complex interactions between things. And so, I mean, personally, I wouldn't say that empathy would be the fourth response in the fear situation, but I would say that it would be it's a really sophisticated response based on everything else that's going on in your environment, your understanding of the situation. But I also think because you have, if I understand you correctly, taken that empathic or taken that approach before, so you have the experience of not getting caught up in an emotion and not be able to get out of it. I mean, that's something, I mean, people who meditate, for instance, right, they spend a lot of time, or rather they become certainly better at not being caught up in the emotion, but being able to take a step back and think, okay, how am I feeling right now? Why am I feeling this way? So that you're not stuck in the cycle of action and reaction, right? And there's almost a sense in which I understood what you're doing in a certain sense by, as it were, being almost outside these individuals and sort of making them see what they're feeling in such a way that they're no longer stuck in feeling that way.
Yeah, in terms of that cycle of action, that in terms of action and reaction, they were in a very action-reaction. Like one person would say something and that would anger the other one, and then the other one would say something would even anger the other. So there was this action-reaction. Yeah. And so you're saying that I'm kind of like standing outside, but in a sense, I'm outside, but I'm inside as well, in the sense that when I was hearing what they were saying, I was accurately reflecting where they were. I was outside of it, but yet I was highly connected to each of them in an empathic space, and they were actually feeling my sense of connection and understanding. So I guess it's like I wasn't like overwhelmed with their distress. It's like I was connected to their distress within a empathic, what I would call an empathic space. And so what I'm kind of hearing from you is that holding that empathic, what I would call an empathic stance or empathic space, that there's a lot of other emotions connected to how you hold that space, in a sense. Like, how is it that I was even willing to hold that space, or capable of holding the space, or had the intention of holding that space? And for me, the reason I hold that is because just through experience, I've seen that if people can hear each other and empathize with each other, that a deeper connection happens, and then actually creativity and innovation happen out of that deeper understanding of each other's feelings and needs, and that there's a creativity and action that happens out of that. So I see that is a really positive way, an enjoyable way of relating and being in the world. So kind of the stance that I come from is, I want to create that space in the world. I want to create an empathic value and space that we create, like you say, the surrounding structures and emotions to support that space. And doing empathic listening or having an empathy circle is like a structure or a form that helps create that container of an empathic space.
Right. So I guess what I would add is that it's not just that you are feeling with the other person, assuming that was what. So you're saying, when the other person was angry, you felt angry for and with them in some sense, or?
I was reflecting. I'm saying, I'm hearing you're feeling very angry. I'm hearing that you're feeling very frustrated. Am I hearing you correctly? So I was picking up their energy, and I could feel their energy, but it doesn't take over my whole awareness. My whole consciousness wasn't kind of like flooded with it. I was still maintaining connection. I was maintaining connection with each person, with myself, as well as everyone else in the room.
Right. So, I mean, I think that there are a number of things that are going on in what you're talking about, and one of them is, in a certain sense, you are maintaining a certain distance at the same time. So you're not feeling exactly what the other person is feeling. You're not getting overwhelmed by it. That is not, as it were, your entire situation. But you are understanding the other, and you're making clear to the other that you're understanding them.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So one of the things that I think is I mean, I would say that what's going on there might, at least a large part of it is, you might think in part as being sort of more cognitive empathy, right? So it's the understanding element, perhaps more than just feeling with the other. I mean, you're sympathetic towards them because you're a sympathetic listener, but perhaps I mean, a lot of it certainly seems to be this more cognitive aspect, right? That they're feeling understood. And in fact, I mean, there are some interesting psychological experiments that suggest that taking others' perspective, understood broadly speaking, which I think sometimes just means thinking more about what they're thinking and feeling, affects our attitude towards them, right? So we find them more likable, and we see more similarities between ourselves and them, and so forth and so on. But it also works the other way around. So if you think that somebody else is taking your perspective, you come to like that person more, and you come to feel more like the other person, and so forth and so on, right? So I think that a lot of the powerful stuff that's going on here is in the understanding of the other. Of course, in a sort of, perhaps not in an entirely cold way, right? But it's not as effectively infused as at least some of the literature talks about when they talk about affective empathy.
Because when I think of it, that was really an effective empathy. I mean, in my experience, for me, the more the imaginative or perspective-taking empathy is sort of like role-playing. Like we do these empathy circles where we have maybe 4 or 5 people, and we do this practicing empathic listening with each other. And one of these circles, one of the participants was having trouble with her creativity and judgment. That when she had a creative idea, that her judgment would come in and kind of beat up her idea to the point where she didn't even want to have creative ideas, because if I'm creative, my judgment is going to come and beat up my idea, and it's going to be so painful. So so what we actually did is, another participant in the circle and we did role playing where I imagined being her creativity, and the other person imagined being her judgment, and then I took on the role. Okay, I am your creativity, and I spoke from whatever arose within myself, being in that role, and I spoke to her judgment, and then her judgment, the person who was acting the role of judgment, reflected back what I was saying. I was saying, oh, I have all these great ideas, but I'm really scared of presenting them. And then the judgment would say, oh, I hear you really have all these great ideas, afraid of them being criticized. And then until I felt heard, then it was turn with the judgment to talk, and I would reflect back what the judgment would say. So we went on for like an hour doing this role playing, and it was like totally transformative for this person in terms of seeing how her internal dialogue of these different parts were interacting with each other. But the part I'm really getting at is, for me, the imaginative empathy is that role playing where I took on the role of her creativity, and spoke from whatever emotions, feelings arose in me, and I would just say them as authentically as I could. And the same thing I've done in mediation, where someone takes on the role of someone else, and they will speak as if they're the father of this person, and speak for whatever comes up for them. So that's kind of how I'm kind of using the word, the imaginative, or the role playing or cognitive empathy. So I'm just wondering how that matches up.
Well, I mean, if you think about Dan Batson's distinction between imagine self and imagine other, right?
Yeah.
You can just imagine other, and just with the imagine other is just think about how the other person is thinking and feeling in the situation, what it's like to be that person in that situation. That's a sort of typical instructions, right? So the idea is that the focus is on the other, and you're trying to think about more in detail about what the other thinks and feels, right? So assuming that a lot of the time we're at least sensitive to others, it's a focusing device, right? So it's a matter of paying attention to the other and thinking a bit more about them, because obviously we don't have the time to think too much about what other people are thinking and feeling all the time. And it sounds to me like the particular role playing that you're not the role playing in the situation you just talked about, but what you did with your sister-in-law and your mother was that by repeating back to them what they have said, you are in a certain sense mimicking what would be thought of as paying attention to how they're thinking and feeling. You know what I mean? Because you're saying, I'm hearing this, meaning it's in my mind that this and this and this is going on. And so from that perspective, what's going on is that the other person, I assume, feels understood and feels that you have an understanding of how they're feeling in their situation.
Yeah, it's also even more in terms that they feel seen and they feel heard. Like, oh, you really heard me. You really took the time and space to really hear what is going on inside myself, and I'm seeing myself reflected in what you're saying. So, in a sense, there's something about that that is a very healing quality. In fact, I would say that it's the essence of therapy in terms of, for example, the work of Carl Rogers. That's the full extent of the primary mode that he used in terms of dealing with people who were in any form of stress, anything from alienation, depression, even schizophrenia he was working with. So.
Well, I mean, it's a very psychoanalytic approach too, right? So, it's a classical approach of psychoanalysts too, to say, oh, what you're saying is, and then they're repeating what.
Well, there's the aspect of there's the aspect of the reflecting, where you can reflect, you can parrot, you can paraphrase, you can summarize, you can just give back the meaning so that someone feels that they're heard. The psychoanalytic, I think it goes into, well, maybe using that as a tool to kind of get the information, maybe like Heinz Kohut was more in that realm, and then you go into kind of an analytical mode with the information that you have to do the the analytical part. But it seems like you don't even need to, from my experience, you don't even really need to do a lot of analysis. It's more it's that connection with people where at least in the therapeutic realm as well as the conflict resolution realm, that seems to be kind of like the active ingredient. Seems to me. I don't know how that.
But again, I mean, the active ingredient is some sort of understanding, right? Feeling understood.
Yeah.
Right. I mean,
I wonder if it's understood.
Not enough that if you think of the other as merely parroting, then I'm assuming that the effect would go off, right? If you think, okay, I'm just going to parrot what you've just said to me without trying to understand it or without whatever, then I'm assuming that the positive benefits would go away. And I think that it's because of the saying back without, distorting or necessarily interpreting, and pretty much repeating what the other person says, because that is typically occurring when it's actually the result of the equivalent understanding in the mind. That's why it has its beneficial effects. Don't you think so?
You're saying, what I'm hearing is that it's about the understanding part that's the active ingredient, in terms of, oh, you're really understanding where I'm coming from, and it's that thinking of understanding that is kind of like the active ingredient. Is that what you're saying?
That's my interpretation. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I guess what it is, I'm not quite sure, but I would think that it's maybe the emotional resonance that is that. If I'm feeling an emotion, that feeling is, I don't know, is kind of being resonated with. That feeling is, it's not just inside myself, but it's being communicated to the other person. Like, oh, I'm really angry. And I'm hearing that you're really angry. It's somehow that has an effect of almost releasing that anger. It's like the anger is no longer contained just inside myself, but that it's kind of moving out into the world, and you've heard me and seen that anger. So I guess I guess I'm kind of thinking, I guess it depends on what understanding means. I guess I'm seeing it as maybe more of like an emotional resonance of sort.
But I mean, I don't understand what the resonance would be, right? Because when you're talking to your sister-in-law and she's angry, you're not getting angry too. Because if you were, it would probably escalate, right? You'd both get angry. Let's go beat the mom up now or something.
Yeah, right.
That's not what you're doing. You're not mirroring the anger, but you're, as it were, I mean, if you're a psychoanalyst, I suppose you would say that you're containing it. But I think you could just understand it as, look, somebody's communicating anger to me, and I'm letting them know that I understand what they're saying, and then feeling understood, first of all. So if you think that the active ingredient is understanding, feeling understood might itself have emotional consequences down the line, but it might be that it's that sense of being understood that sets off the process, the other emotional process, where I'm assuming that what probably happens is that the other person feels better towards you. She will like you more. I mean, that's a kind of classical result in perspective-taking literature, right? That the other person will like you more, and that's going to make it feel like you're more connected to one another. I think that is a separate result from reflecting the emotion of the other, right? It is emotional, but I wouldn't call it an empathic emotion, technically speaking, in that particular instance, right? Because it is a sense of being close to and liking and so forth and so on that is caused by understanding, that is caused by thinking about the other and so forth and so on, right? But affective empathy, technically speaking, if you were empathizing with her, as I use the term empathy, right, you would be angry too. Or you could feel sympathetic towards her and you could say, oh, you know, I feel so bad for you, etc. But that was also not what you were doing, right? You were doing something very specific, namely, as far as I can tell, going through the motions that are saying the kinds of things that one would say if one understood the other.
Yeah, for me it seems like it was heading towards emotional resonance. Like as the reflection kept going and everyone was reflecting back and forth, it's like people were becoming more and more attuned with each other at an emotional level. I guess it kind of depends on what the word understanding means. You know, how I think of, you know, like a psychopath supposedly has understanding, right? That I guess they have as I understand it, cognitive empathy. So it seemed to me that it was more of a resonance, because the overall effect happened that my mother and sister-in-law were sitting next to each other, totally connected and warm, and you know, having the warm fuzzy kind of feeling with each other. and like a real sense of understanding. So there was like a real, it was bringing them to deeper and deeper, I would say, like emotional, almost their souls resonating with each other. So I guess it depends on, I mean, it seems like we probably can't disconnect the feeling and the understanding and all the, I mean, it's not like they're just two separate things anyway. They're,
Well, I mean, I guess it depends a little bit on what you're trying to do, right? So if you're trying to understand, if you're trying to understand, well, what is a specifically empathic reaction versus what might an empathic reaction give rise to, then, so at least as philosophers, and I think as psychologists, we're very interested in chopping the world up in smaller pieces so we can understand them. And sometimes that might be a mistake, but I think that it's, if you're talking about the positive effects of understanding others, etc., there might be lots of effects down the line that are not themselves part of the understanding itself, right, but might be caused by the understanding. So I think that it's not clear to me that we disagree so much about what you're talking about so much as how we should describe it, right? So I have a preference for trying to be as precise as possible about does this term apply here appropriately and so forth and so on. So that's where I would, I guess, prefer to talk about, well, there was an understanding that then gave rise to a liking and a sense of connection, and there's all this very good data that suggests that perspective taking in either just thinking about the other more, not necessarily putting yourself in their position, does lead to a sense that you're more like the other. So that sort of self-other overlap might have been kind of connected with what was going on between your sister-in-law and your mother, more so than any actual contagion, for instance, of emotion, but just a sense of closeness and a sense of, one's, as it were, ego boundaries being somewhat attenuated. Or, how can I put it, permeable by the other person.
Yeah, well, that basic dynamic is what I see, like I'm saying, is kind of the active ingredient in the whole therapeutic realm, which I'm not into therapy. I think we should just have that attitude in the culture, which is what I'm looking at. How do we create a whole culture that values and supports that empathic connection, create a culture that has the structures that support that way of people getting together? And that's in terms of just for well-being as well as for conflict resolution. And just that basic empathic listening seems to be just a really powerful process in general, I've been finding, in terms of really fostering empathy.
But of course, the empathic listening requires that you're able to bring online the empathic, the listening. You're already angry, right? And that's when I was talking about emotion regulation, right? That was what I was hinting at, right? So I think that one of the things that's often overlooked is our capacity to be aware of the emotions that we're experiencing without being swept away by them. Does that make sense? I mean, so you know, in the philosophical literature, for instance, I mean, somebody as early as the Stoics were very concerned with regulating the emotions, right? I mean, they thought we should get rid of them altogether. That might be exaggerating, right? But one of the things they were very concerned about was this sense in which the emotions gave us a distorted view of what was of value, and then pulled us along in ways that our reason would conflict in some interesting sense our reason, and a lot of techniques were, I think, directly aimed at trying to regulate the strong emotional responses that we have to various situations, like anger or grief, for instance. It seems to me that the situation that you're describing is one of anger, right? And incidentally, Seneca wrote a very interesting treatise on anger and the ills of anger and how to overcome it. But it does seem as if anger it's one of those, you respond angrily to somebody else, and then there is a ratcheting up of anger and resentment, etc., etc. And so it seems as if in many ways anger just is a very destructive emotion. And what I think what you were describing was that you were stepping in and diffusing or allowing anger to be expressed to you, and so that there's not another angry response that then leads to more anger.
Exactly.
And so I think that a really important thing, together with listening to others and so forth and so on, is the ability to regulate our own emotions.
Yeah. Would it be, so you're saying that it's like the idea is that you get swept up in others' emotion. If someone has an emotion like anger or fear, that you would get pulled into their fear or anger, or kind of do the ratcheting up of the anger.
Well, I mean, there are two different situations, right? So there's the situation in which, let's say your spouse comes home and is really angry, right? And you listen to them, and then you become angry at the same thing, and then you can be really angry together. And that might be cathartic, I suppose, but it could also, just not be helpful. And then there's a situation in which you are the object of somebody else's anger, right? And then the emotion that you feel would be a reactive emotion, right? So that would be the sort of appropriate response to anger, maybe not appropriate, but the standard approach, let's say, and that would probably be anger in return. Like that's a classical thing, right? Somebody's angry with you and starts complaining, you feel often threatened, and then you become angry, right? It's a sort of almost self-defensive approach, right? And so the idea, I think, is to have the capacity to then notice what is happening in these situations, right? Because a lot of times these responses are almost automatic, right? You just find yourself, you get the sinking feeling of being afraid, and now you're reacting. And often, for instance, you might react with aggression, right? Counterattack, right? And before you know it, you're in this, swept up in this cycle of action and reaction, or retaliation, or something like that, right?
Yeah,
and
it's like
in order to be able to use the approach that you talked about listening, you have to first be able to somehow stop that response, right? And that requires the ability to, as it were, step back and not respond, or be aware of the emotion that you're having, and by being aware of it, being able to, in some interesting sense, keep it contained.
Yeah, well, that response that you're talking about, I mean, well, there's the ratcheting up, and we have things like the war in Syria or Iraq, which is, it's just a terrible ratcheting up, and it has terrible consequences in the world. And so I guess what I'm seeing is empathy is the way of it's like a way of being, that if we can foster a way of being, that we can foster that connection between people, and keeping from going into that ratcheting up and into those negative emotions. And I guess I wonder, does that seem like, so I guess that's what my stance that I come from is, we need a culture of empathy, which is to really value empathy and to be promoting it within society, because it's that state that keeps us from to do more problem solving versus getting into these emotions that where we do ratchet up or get into anger or into fear.
I mean, I partly agree with you, but I think that empathy is a very limited resource, right? I just think that there's only so much empathizing you can do in a day without being emotionally depleted, right? And so I don't think it's going to solve the problems for people living as close together as most of us are in big cities. I think that there are a lot of just standard approaches and regulations and not paying attention, when others are getting angry at you or whatever is probably very useful, right? When you have more, direct interactions with people, then certainly. But I suppose I would also say that I think that whereas empathy, be it cognitive or affective, and sympathy are all useful tools, I do think that there's a separate thing that I was talking about, which I've called emotion regulation, perhaps somewhat unhelpfully, but that's a separate element without which the other elements probably aren't going to do the good job that they'd be able to do. Does that make sense? So you need the sort of the balance and the ability to deal successfully with the emotions that you might bring on yourself by empathizing, even effectively, with others.
Well, I'm hearing that it's like you're saying that if you're empathizing with people, that you become depleted yourself, and so so empathy isn't necessarily by itself a mode for building a culture of empathy. Because if you're just empathizing with people all the time, that you're going to become depleted yourself. So there's other things, other capacities that you need to foster.
I think probably two separate things. So the kind of cases that I'm thinking about is doctors, nurses, healthcare workers, aid workers, etc., right? These are people who will be exposed to an enormous amount of suffering during one day. And compassion fatigue is a real phenomenon where people burn out. They simply can't, they don't have the capacity to take in that much suffering in a day, right? And so often that leads to sometimes people cutting off altogether or whatever. I don't think it's a solution to say we need doctors to empathize more, because I think we're just going to deplete them. I mean, which one of us could stand sitting and listening to 30 people, 10 of which might have terminal diseases in one day? I mean, that would be very difficult, right? So probably maybe a slightly different approach, although the one that you talk about, which is where you're sort of listening perhaps sympathetically, but maybe not necessarily experiencing all the deep emotions, might be sufficient to make people, maybe a lot of things that patients need to do is to be understood better than necessarily, the physician experiencing, this great outpouring of emotion, for instance, right? So that's, I think we need to understand a little bit more about what happens to people who are, as it were, in the front line of suffering, if that makes sense, right? So they don't become depleted. I mean, most of us luckily can turn the television off, et cetera, et cetera. So it's always easy for us to say that those people should be more empathetic, right? But it's a really hard thing. But what I was suggesting was in the kinds of encounters where it makes sense to, empathize with people, to feel the emotions that they're feeling and to sympathize and so forth and so on, right? It's also very important to be an emotionally well-balanced individual, so one needs to also have this extra ingredient of being able to relate to one's emotions appropriately.
Okay, so what I was hearing there is that people who are on the front lines of suffering and distress, that if they're empathizing all the time, like doctors, social workers, etc., that they would become depleted, and if we tell them just be more empathic, they're just going to burn out. And so there's that aspect.
What you're talking about, right? So I mean, affective empathy, sympathy, where there's a lot of emotional involvement with each patient. Yeah.
Oh, so with patients, for example, and that there could be something. It depends on how they're empathizing. If they might be able to take more of a mode of empathy which doesn't deplete them as much.
I mean, it may be possible. I don't
Uh-huh.
know that we know enough about these things, but I mean, when you were talking about empathetic listening, right? I think that's a little different than feeling for the patient
Uh-huh.
in the
It's more the sympathy. The feeling for is more the
exactly, right.
sympathetic
So
response. Uh-huh.
yeah.
Kind of
So I
feeling
think
sorry
that
for someone.
right. So I think that the idea, yeah, exactly. So it the actual listening to, and I think somebody like Halpern, I don't know if you know any of
Oh
her.
yeah, I interviewed her. I've got a whole
Oh,
series with her. Jody
right.
Halpern. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Because I mean, I think what she has talked more about is also more the sort of understanding element, right, of listening to the patient, which actually can have really good benefits. And that is one form of empathy, but that's not necessarily the empathy that a lot of people are talking about when they're
Hmm.
saying they need, people to be more empathetic, right? So I think it's important just to be aware that the sort of affective element of empathy is, I think, a relatively limited resource, not super limited, but for the people who are exposed to a lot of suffering, right? That might be too high demand to.
Hmm. Well, the one
Uh,
thing I say that I hear the about the burnout and so forth. But for me, that tends to be sort of an individualistic view that, oh, we're expecting the doctor to empathize with the patient, for example, or the social worker to empathize. And for me, that is kind of an individualistic, kind of a one-way view. It's not what I would call a culture of empathy. So in a culture of empathy is that all parties are empathizing with each other. So it's the patient or empathizing with the doctor, for example. The social worker client is empathizing with the social worker, as well as the burnout or the stress that doctors are having or social workers. Is they them that for me that's more like an empathy deficit in that they are not getting the empathy they need from society or people around them. So for me, actually, what would be called compassion fatigue, or some even call it, empathy fatigue, is actually empathy deficit fatigue.
well, I mean, I think that, I mean, it sounds to me, I don't know how to put it, maybe a bit idealistic insofar as I think that, if somebody comes to the doctor and they're suffering from all these physical symptoms, right, they're going
Right,
to be wrapped up in themselves, and it's too much to expect them
right,
to empathize with the doctor who's going to diagnose them, right? Or people who are extremely poor, who are struggling to get along, or people who are being beaten by their partners or whatever. It's too much to expect them to empathize with the person who's dealing with them. Does that make sense?
yeah. It's like people who
So
are
I,
in such deep distress. People who are in such deep distress, they don't have the capacity
exactly.
to empathize with someone else.
Right, right.
Uh,
I mean, I think it's easy for some of us if we spend a lot of the time sitting at home doing pleasant things, and then we're exposed to someone. It's easy, we have all this energy,
right.
assuming that we're well fed and so forth and so on, right? Extra energy to give, but I think a lot, and people who are depressed, for instance, will find it difficult to muster. The energy, right? But those are, of course, a lot of the people who, if you were to empathize with them, would cause a lot of empathic suffering in return, right? So the people who are very sick, the people who are very poor, the people who are mistreated, the people who are suffering terribly for depression, right? So it's it's just I think. I think empathy is and effective empathy or sympathy are wonderful things, but they have limits
Uh, yeah.
too.
So
Uh,
I'm hearing that it's sort of an idealistic view in terms of that everyone could empathize with everyone else, and that there's the empathy itself has limits to it. Is that kind of
yes, so I mean, we need to look at the sort of sociological and the psychological limitations. Uh, so as I said, I just think a lot of people aren't in a position to empathize with others, and maybe we shouldn't expect them to be able to.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you're dying of terminal cancer, should you really empathize with the people who are coming to your bedside? I mean, would it be reasonable for them to say, look, I need to understand how upsetting you being sick is for me? I mean, that just seems, that doesn't seem right. Does that make sense? So
Yeah, it's like people who are in deep distress, they're kind of in a special, they almost need like emergency empathy. They just don't, they're like drowning perhaps, and they just don't have the capacity. We shouldn't have the expectation on them that they should empathize with others because they're in such deep distress themselves. So they're kind of needing emergency empathy from the people around them and having an understanding for that. Is kind of how what I was hearing there. I guess what I'm looking at is that we can create more of an environment that's containers for empathy, in the sense that the person who's terminally ill, if they would have had a family empathy, you know, that family would have been empathic, they had that empathic support in their family to begin with. For example, they're having empathy circles or whatever in their family, that's adding a little bit of empathic support. The doctor themselves who are maybe getting burned out, that they're needing kind of empathic support. They're needing maybe like empathic circles with other doctors, you know, within their families, so that they're building that resilience, that empathic resilience needs to be built in the larger culture to create that capacity, so that when those difficulties happen, you know, when those crises happen, that we have deeper cultural resilience to hold those stresses. For example, that conflict in my family, I think the only reason I was able to kind of hold that is because I had done a lot of empathic listening and practice, and had received a lot of empathy and hearing myself. So I had more capacity for that, and that we're needing to create a larger culture that is supportive of that way of being. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I don't know really what to say about that. I mean, I think that on the one hand, I just think it might be very inefficient.
Uh-huh.
I mean, I think it might involve a tremendous amount of psychological and affective resources, where other means might be more more efficient. I mean, it strikes me, I mean, one of the things that I think about the sort of situation that you talk about with the empathy is, right, that stuff is really important, and it really matters in a close interpersonal relationships, right? But when it comes to society at large, which is composed of, particularly in a global society, right, of billions of individuals, it's not clear to me that that is the most it's not clear to me that it's necessarily that useful under those circumstances.
Yeah, so I'm hearing there you're thinking that maybe within close circle of like a family it might be helpful and useful, but if you kind of extrapolate to the larger global system, then it would be very time consuming and maybe not that effective. There might be other more effective ways of creating positive.
Right. So I mean, it's not that I think that it's contained to families, but, you know, friends, colleagues, and so forth and so on, right? So when I mean the sort of interpersonal stuff, I mean the people that you have more close personal contact with. There it strikes me that the sort of, in particular, the kind of understanding of others, and sitting down and taking the time to understand where they're coming from, etc., is extremely helpful. But I don't see how that can be extended far beyond that, given that I just think we have limited psychological and psychological resources.
Mm-hmm. So that the empathy has a limit to the people around us, and dealing with kind of the global issues, it may not be that effective and have its limits. Is that kind of what you're, or at least you're not seeing the way that empathy would have a larger effect on this, on the larger society?
Well, it depends on what you mean by empathy having an effect on larger society. I mean, it strikes me that clearly, if you're interacting with the people around you in a more understanding and considerate and reflective way, that's going to have, it's going to be like ripples on the water, right? And extends through the positive benefits that it has on other people and in their other circles, because we're all, if you think of us as sort of all partially overlapping circles. So from that perspective, I think yes. But when it comes to, if you think about more superordinate structures, then it's harder for me to see what's, how that would work.
So superordinate being like countries and larger societies like that? Is that the superordinate structures, or justice system, political systems?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, well, that's the core of what kind of the work that I'm doing is how do we actually create a culture of empathy? So that's kind of like the work, the exploration that I'm doing is how do we actually create that larger worldwide culture that supports and raises the value of empathy. So that's really how that will affect the larger society is really the kind of a core question that I'm working on.
Yeah, and it could be that it could affect it from the small, as it were, from the smaller circles outwards. But I suppose I don't, depending, of course, again, on what exactly you mean by empathy, it's not, I don't see it as a cure-it-all for the ills of society. Although I see it as a very important feature in the way that we engage with others.
Well, this is, I don't want to, we've gone for quite a while here, and I really enjoyed this conversation, because I thought we would go kind of systematically through your chapter, and I'm really grateful that you kind of created space to kind of explore this family, story and kind of relate your understandings and insights into the dynamics of that. And so I'm really thankful and grateful that for this dialogue. And my sense is that we could go for maybe a whole series of sessions around this, because there's a whole bunch of other areas to cover around empathy. And so I guess we should probably bring it to a close at this point, but maybe we can pick it up. We want to do another talk in a later time about the different chapters, what each of the chapters of your book cover. Yeah. And so that's going to be the next one. And I'm thinking of maybe reaching out to some of the authors and seeing if we can do a bit of an interview around each of the chapters too. Yeah. Or perhaps we could even do that together, so that might be just to kind of continue this conversation, because it's a never-ending, ongoing exploration about the nature of empathy. And we haven't even gotten into like creativity and empathy. That's like a whole nother aspect that I think would be really fun to talk about. So, okay, well then with that, I'm just going to stop the broadcast. Is there any final thoughts you have that you'd like to share before I do that?
No, I enjoyed very much the conversation. Thank you.